Hello, everybody. Uh, my name is Dave McCombs. I'm president of the club, and I was invited by Bradley to get things started here and just say a few things. And I have to say, I'm very honored that Brad has included me in this event. I'm not really worthy to be up here speaking like this, but I'm very grateful to be among such esteemed peers. There's a lot of history in this room, and the man that we're here to honor embodies history of the club and beyond it. He's actually literally made history. Brad has also explained to me that this event is an occasion for mirth as much as for grief, and that's the way Mike would have wanted it. So first of all, I would like to say for Mike's family, friends, and acquaintances, you have my deepest condolences for your loss, and also please forgive me if I tread too lightly from here on the subject. So as evidence that I'm not really worthy of standing up and speaking to you, I'm going to have to reveal and admit that in preparation for this, I consulted ChatGPT. This is an AI function that generates text. Yes, yes, that's the way I went. And as you know, ChatGPT generates text on a prediction basis, and therefore it's often wrong. It often plagiarizes and generates fake news, basically. But I'm here to report, and you decide. So keep in mind what I'm about to read you. It definitely set off my fake news buzzer. But again, I will leave it to you, and I will leave it to people who actually knew Mike well, such as Brad, to set the record straight. But what ChatGPT has, you wouldn't believe that they have quite a few details about Mike. Actually, the veracity of those is subject to some question, but let's see. So Mike was, this is what ChatGPT delivered. Mike was a relentlessly self-improving storyteller from Belgium with low-grade narcolepsy and a penchant for buggery. He married an 18-year-old French acrobat with webbed feet. He would womanize. He would drink. He would make outrageous claims like he invented the question mark. Sometimes he would accuse chestnuts of being lazy, the sort of general malaise that only genius possess and the insane lament. Mike's childhood was typical: summers in Rangoon, luge lessons. In spring, he'd make meat helmets. When he was insolent, he was placed in a burlap bag and beaten with reeds. At age 12, he took his first scribe. At age 14, a Zoroastrian woman named Vilma ritualistically shaved his testicles. He came to believe there is really nothing like a shorn scrotum. He described it as breathtaking. So, I think I need to relinquish the stage now to a real journalist and to say some real things about the real Mike Tharp, a tireless journalist, faithful friend, and courageous leader. Please welcome Brad Martin.
Thank you, and thank you, Dave and ChatGPT, for that highly accurate summary of Mike's career. Our tradition for these memorials used to be just this, a roast, essentially. Whoever happens to have departed from us must endure a roast here on his way to the hereafter or whatever after there is. And so this is the perfect beginning for our discussion of the guy that we've just lost. And Mike, by the way, he loved humor that was directed at him. You know, he's the opposite of Donald Trump, who has a thin skin and does not want any humor directed at him. Mike would go and recite these jokes that people had made at his expense. That was part of the great character of the guy that we have just lost. He'd have laughed very long and loud at this chat GPT biography. Thank you, Dave. When I speak of tradition, I should mention that I'm talking about the tradition of my own generation. And I see that there are more than one of you who are part of that generation. That's wonderful. We're getting a pretty good crowd here in the club, and I hope you'll keep coming back. But what we have in the club's current regular membership appears to be a generational split. Most of the older generation, the war and uprising journalists are gone. The ones who used to like to come into the club and tell war stories around the correspondent tables. And this, of course, was how we were founded at the end of World War II, at the beginning of the occupation. We were founded by people who loved to tell the stories. Some of these correspondents had come all the way across the Pacific to get here into our first quarters here in Tokyo. They're mostly gone now. And so are mostly the Vietnam War folks. Certainly the Korean War people are almost all gone. We still have Charles Pomeroy, maybe one or two others. Charles Pomeroy. I can't think of others. Are there any others from the Korean War who are still around? Vietnam War, we have a few left. And then probably the last big violent uprising was the South Korean struggle for democracy. We had a lot of people from here who covered that and came back and wanted to sit around the table and talk about it, you know. It was the kind of thing you wanted to talk about. So this was a wild and woolly place at one time. People spinning yarns about real adventures they had had. But it's changed, of course. The new generation of correspondents is a little different. Some of them take conscious and vocal pride in never stepping foot into our food and beverage operations here. They're proud of it. They want to brag about it. Have you heard that? I've heard it. But anyway, there are socio-political, geopolitical reasons for all of this. Japan's replacement by China as the upstart country about which people write books like Japan is number one, or the Japan that can say no. Nobody's writing those books anymore here. They may be writing them over in Beijing. Correspondingly narrower concentration of interest in the Japan story. So most of the people who cover Japan these days are covering finance, I would guess. If we took a poll, we'd probably find that's the majority. The gradual replacement by Seoul of Tokyo as the place where you're home based if you're going to cover Northeast Asia, general news, political news. The long overdue rise in women's rights that has had many of the biggest names in journalism appoint women as their Tokyo bureau chiefs. Well, a bunch of those happen to be mothers, and they quite admirably go home after work and take care of their children. And then we have a concurrent shift to more domesticated male correspondents who also want to go straight home from work and take care of the kids and the pets and so on. And especially after 2020 with the COVID, they've been spending even more time at home. So, who is here to sit around the round tables and tell the stories anymore? The preponderance of the Tokyo correspondent population has changed from roaming to settled. Now, if you've studied any Chinese history, you know as well as I do that the Yuan dynasty, which was formed by Mongol horsemen, was succeeded by the Ming, who were Chinese tillers of the soil. So we may be looking at a cyclical phenomenon. Members pay their dues. They never spend a dime on food, beverages here. They come only for pack functions where there's no meal charge. Maybe they'll give way to another generation of adventurous storytellers. That depends to a great extent on what happens regionally and globally, and it isn't within our control. My guess, though, is what we're experiencing is not merely cyclical, but, as in the case of the now tomb-like Washington National Press Club, permanent. Means that only a bare handful of still active, old-time news person geezers who still gather eagerly at the FCCJ round tables, consuming booze and telling and listening to stories, before long will be gone forever. Okay, so where does that take us? History does tend to move on, and we can't stop it, but we can celebrate our memories of the great bygone days, particularly on a day like this when we mark the departure of one of our most prominent Hail Fellows Well Met. Can I have a little applause for that little line there? Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. Mike Tharp came from people who kept moving. His mama, Carrie Mae, was from her early teen years a trapeze artist, along with two brothers. With a family-owned traveling circus, she saw 46 U.S. states before she was 20. Half of who I am is her, Mike wrote. Here's the opening of a poem he wrote about his mother in 1978 called The Girl Who Never Fell. On those nights, the clowns were your cue, and when they shambled off fumbling for Bull Durham sacks, their watermelon smiles now greasy with sweat, you went on. Even a trapeze act can become just a job, but when you stood in your turquoise tights on tiptoe in the ramp, looking over your brother's broad sequined shoulders at the sawdust and smoke spun by spotlights into weightless gold, hearing your name shouted above 100 murmurs and feeling the belly flies that always fluttered then. On those nights, there was nowhere else to be and nothing else to do, except again to fly from the wrists and hands of one brother to the other and back and forth again. That was just his mother. As for his dad, who was a railway detective, Mike memorably wrote this: Papa was a god. He wore a 38 snub-nosed police special to work every day in a shoulder holster. For nearly 40 years, he was a special agent, a railroad bull for the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. Did I get the rhythm of that correct, according to the old song? The Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. All right. In Oklahoma City, Kansas City, and Topeka. Until his first heart attack at age 65, he never worked out. Yet, at 6'2", 195 pounds, he was a cross between Tarzan and Superman. This is Buck writing, okay? He had a 4-pack softball-sized biceps and a manta ray of black hair across his chest. He was also a lifelong subscriber to The New Yorker, read the dictionary at lunch, and turned me on to Catch-22 when I was in college. We were used to him being out of town. He'd get a call in the middle of the night, grunt into the phone, and start dressing. He always had a bag packed. He called it a grip. Then he'd head off to a freight car derailment, a card sharp on the super chief, a fight on the El Capitan, an employee trying to scam the railroad. He styled himself after the 1940s actor Ronald Colman with a pencil-thin mustache. A lot of people thought he looked like Clark Gable without the jug ears. He was not the strong, silent type. He loved to talk and laugh, especially at himself. Once, after he got his eyes dilated, he went into their bathroom. I looked down and there were two of them, he told us later. Being a proud man, I reached for the bigger one. It wasn't there. He was my scoutmaster in Boy Scouts. In 1956, on the way to a scout meeting, he was talking about knots. The radio on our push-button Plymouth suddenly started playing Jailhouse Rock. Papa must have noticed me starting to dance in the passenger seat. He leaned over and switched off the radio, but from then on I was hooked on Elvis. His fave was the Mills Brothers. For being a lifetime lawman, Papa was fascinated by bad guys. In the bathtub he sang, "I am the king of the outlaws, as I ride, ride, ride." He read a book called The Big Con several times. He loved the movie The Sting. He collected wanted posters from the early 20th century in the Santa Fe Files, especially of train robbers. There's more to this, but I think I better move on. You've got to see the influences on the showman that we knew as Mike Tharp. I mean, his parents just were the perfect prototypes for what we finally got here in Tokyo. You can see so many influences from them. The travel bug, the physical details from muscles to mustache, the self-deprecating good humor, the love of a party, making sure to be there for those you should be there for, and the words, always the words. Mike chased the words very early as a copy boy for a Kansas newspaper. Became a world traveler first as a graduate student when he left his native western United States to study at a university in Cardiff, Wales, where he honed his natural-born skills as a poet. How many of us studied poetry in graduate school before we came into this profession? We should have. Really, we should have, And then he went to Vietnam for his first war. The Army had the sense to assign him to a job suited to his ability and background, Army newspaper work. And he did well, left with a Bronze Star pinned on him. And after he returned to the United States and got a domestic start at the Wall Street Journal, his intensive exposure to Asia was noted and acted upon, so they dispatched him to Tokyo. I think that was 1976. Am I correct? Who knows? Now, was that right? 76. I think that's right. As bureau chief to replace Norm Pearlstein. Now, I hope that Norm is watching on the Zoom channel. He said he might if he could wake up in the middle of the night. He's in Vancouver. Okay. Mike wrote as follows about some of his early Tokyo reporting in '78 at Narita. You'll recall that the farmers did not like losing their land to make an airport. Okay, I'm going to let you read this somewhere else. This is elsewhere, but I should read it because Chief's here. All right. Atypically for Japan, a consensus had not been reached among those affected by the construction. The protests intensified as Narita's opening drew near. That spring, along with my Wall Street Journal partner, Masayoshi Kanabayashi, there he is, and Tracy Dalby of the Far Eastern Economic Review. I went to report on the trouble. Some 6,000 protesters turned out, and even more policemen. Usually the two sides moved in kabuki-like choreography. The protesters snake dancing, arms locked, right up to the cops who held their ground. It was more carnival than crusade. We interviewed several people during their breaks for rice balls and green tea, then took a train back to Tokyo to file. Even so, the airport opened in May. So I was involved in some of those trips out to Narita, along with Hideko Takayama in the Baltimore Sun Bureau. Our offices were on the same floor of the Nikkei building, the 8th floor of the old Nihon Keizai Shimbun building in Otemachi. And there were about 8 bureaus there. We were called the Gaijin Ghetto, which is kind of cute, don't you think? All right. So there was the Far Eastern Economic Review, the Financial Times, Economist, Asian Wall Street Journal, and of course the U.S. Wall Street Journal. Let's see, New York Journal of Commerce, the Fairfax papers, alternating between the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age, Toronto Globe and Mail. We were all there in this little space, and as you can imagine, since you are of a generation that did such things, most of you, several times a week we would head out and drink together, right? Okay. So we would often start in a watering hole right in the building or next door, but many times we would just get straight into a walking mode, or usually a cab, because Tracy Dalby preferred to take taxi cabs. Are you listening, Tracy? And we would go down to what Tracy, I believe it was Tracy or Buck, one of them, first started calling the fuckage. Am I right that these guys invented this acronym for what was not intended to be an acronym? It was intended to be an abbreviation, FCCJ, right? All right. So the ghetto rats were not by any means the only people converging on the club's main bar in those days. The world's leading newspapers, people were here in the club drinking together. Clyde Haberman from the New York Times, Sam Jameson from the LA Times, Peter Hazelhurst, who had been kicked out of India when he worked for the Times of London, and he was working by then for the Straits Times of Singapore, using the workroom as his office. So he'd pop out for coffee 5 or 6 times a day, but in the evening his wife would be waiting for him at a table in the main bar, and he would sit down and join the rest of us. It was a very comfortable lifestyle. 900 yen for the correspondence lunch. You could afford to drink here. We need it to be like that again. You knew I'd say that, didn't you? Okay. It wasn't just the Western press. Representatives of various Soviet news organizations joined us. We, at some point, gave them regular status, which had been denied to them earlier, along with any other state-run news organizations. So when we gave them regular status, I believe we also gave regular status to Stars and Stripes and VOA and a few organizations like that. Anyway, these Soviet guys, they were getting increasingly agitated in the late 80s, and by the time the Iron Curtain fell, they were mostly delighted, and they would they had no compunction about telling us what their rank had been. One who had been on the board, he was a colonel in the KGB. Some of you may remember him, a delightful fellow. He's been back once or twice. Actually, he loves this club, and he did not stick with KGB type organizations when he went back to Russia. Sometimes the members of our merry band would stay on telling stories in the club quite late, after last order, and after the departure of the main bar staff. Well, it was all set up for us. No problem. There was, on the back edge of the bar, a refrigerator, and in it were beers and sandwiches, and beside it was a coffee machine and a bunch of cups. And all you had to do was sign a chit saying, I have consumed this, and you could go at it all night if you wanted to. So we did that. Other nights we'd move on to, after a decent interval, to Roppongi, in particular to Kento's. Does anybody remember Kento's? Raise your hand if you remember Kento's. All right. Kento's was a rock and roll bar. I believe we danced there. Is that correct? It was not only a bar, but you were expected to dance. And one of our great advisors on when to go to Kento's was Jeff Tudor, who had, before he came to Japan as Japan Airlines international PR boss, he had, thank you. Is that a martini? He had been an impresario. He had been a rock impresario in the north of England, and he knew all the great groups. So he knew which night to go to Kento's. Jeff was helping me prepare for this evening, but he came down with COVID, went into the hospital. He's out now, and I hope he is out there. Are you out there, Jeff, on Zoom? I hope so. If you want to check out more about how we spent our leisure time back then, there's an article in #1 Shimbun, Salute to the Gaijin Ghetto Rats. It's in this package that Iwamoto-san has prepared for you. All right. Among our old group, not only Buck Tharp, but others before him have passed on. They include Richard Hansen of the Financial Times, Charles Smith of the Financial Times and Far Eastern Economic Review, Al Cullison of the Journal of Commerce, and John Slee of the Sydney Morning Herald. Richard and Charles were still based in Tokyo when they left us. They were, like Mike, far too young, and we held gatherings much like this to remember them. The tradition of roasting the deceased was firmly in place. Richard's old language school pal, Dick Belcher, stood up at the podium and said, if Richard had only eaten his broccoli, he'd still be with us. Am I right or am I wrong? Who was here then?
It was you that said that.
Huh?
It was you that said that frequently.
Well, no, it was actually Belcher who said that. All right. I don't see Keiko and... Oh, there you are, Keiko and Katsuko. All right, so we have two of the merry widows over there. Keiko Hansen and Katsuko Usami, who is Charles Smith's widow. Anyway, we still remember lovingly your husbands, and you too. Keep coming to our club, please. So I mentioned, oh, thank you. Do you think I need another martini? Yes. All right. I mentioned storytelling. Tharp, as you will remember, had more than his share of stories to tell. I was along for the genesis of many of them in Korea in the 70s and 80s. I've got a long passage I could read here about South Korea and the democracy movement. I'll pass over it because I don't want to talk too long. After Mike left Tokyo in 1990 following his term as club president, oh, by the way, this is fascinating. You see this document that's sitting around here that Iwamoto-san has kindly researched and put together for us. I had not really remembered that Pat Killen ran against Mike Tharp for president in 1989. Now, that was a straw man candidacy, as he makes clear in this statement here. I mean, everybody knew Mike was going to be elected, and you had to have two nominees in those days. So Killen had volunteered to be the sacrificial lamb. Well, both of them ended up living in Plano, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas. And when I went to Mike's Plano, Texas memorial gathering, I think it must have been in March, Pat Killen was there at age 94 in a wheelchair. And the next month, Pat Killen died, and I ended up attending his memorial by Zoom because I couldn't get it up to drive again over to Plano, Texas. It's a long drive, friends. Anyway, so we've lost two of the great ones. Pat was, as I said, he was 94. I believe someone else is 94 here. Would that be you, Goto-san?
Goto-san is 94.
Are you 94?
Goto-san.
All right. Well, we are so fortunate to have some of our older and wiser members here. So after Mike left here, his U.S. based career, proceeded through several phases, included various combinations of reporting, editing, studying, and teaching. See Tracy Dalby's brilliant obituary. I think that's in here too, right? Is that into this? Is this in here? Tracy Dalby's obituary. Let's read.
And then next page.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I sent you a. You've got a. If you don't find it in here, the Tracy's obit is listed. It is linked to in the announcement for tonight's gathering. So. So he was reporting, editing, studying, and teaching. And by the way, Tracy Dalby has entrusted me with his fee for writing the obituary for number one Shimbun, and I will use it to buy the first round in the Nijikai over and at the round tables in the main bar. This is the way we always did it, folks. We didn't just have this one session here. We were multiple party people back in those days. We would go from a room like this back into the main bar and continue the party because we had stamina. Anyway, Mike's Vietnam War experience stood him in good stead in one major activity of that post-Tokyo period was covering wars. He covered a lot of wars. He was usually there representing U.S. News and World Report, later the McClatchy chain. But in the end, he began to suspect, and many of us friends agreed with him, that Uncle Sam had signed his death warrant back in Vietnam in the 70s in the form of Agent Orange or other color-coded defoliant poisons that the Americans weaponized in the Vietnam War. He wrote about this eloquently for my paper, Asia Times, and for others. He got around to personalizing things toward the end. His reporting was not personal. He was reporting on the veterans who had suffered this. He didn't say, I've got this. But then on Facebook, for those who knew him, he started opening up, saying, yeah, this is what's happened to me. So he was writing about his bone marrow cancer for people that he knew personally. So let me read to you this. Well, hell, there goes my goal of becoming a male stripper in my dotage. 10 chemo injections over the past 5 days raised roseate chainmail blobs around my belly, marring my dreams of glitter and a silver pole. The chemo kills bone marrow cancer. It also kills red and white blood cells and platelets to wean those messengers of life to my heart from the dolly-shaped, D-A-L-I, dolly-shaped cancer that's clogging my veins and arteries. It was diagnosed a month ago. That explained why I've had severe shortness of breath since April 2020. 2 stents inserted then didn't help much. I've been on oxygen tethered to a walker since May. A covey of ists tried to figure it out. Finally, a hematologist scraped my hip's bone marrow in late August. Eureka. Now I'm 1 week on chemo, 3 weeks off. Geraldine, that's his wife, his former college sweetheart, he finally hooked up with again in Texas. On Facebook. Has been a combo of Florence Nightingale and Nurse Ratched. My kids, close fam, and friends make me feel like a homecoming candidate. This will last 4 to 6 months. Appreciate any good reads or flicks I might like. Then I'll go with John Keats. Can death be sleep when life is but a dream, and scenes of bliss pass as a phantom by? The transient pleasures as a vision seem, and we think the greatest pains to die. And he closed with his trademark sign-off. Meanwhile, comma, peace. He writes out comma. That's the way, in capital comma, capital peace. Meanwhile, comma, peace. I can't find all of his exact words on the day when I could sense from his Facebook post that he'd received the ultimate bad news regarding the efficacy of all that chemo. But I have remembered 2 of those words. He wrote to the effect that there comes a day when you wake up and learn something for which the only appropriate comment is, oh, fuck. As the late Georgia humorist Louis Grizzard famously said of his own situation at the time of Elvis's demise, I wasn't feeling so good myself. Before I could get it together to drive from Louisiana over to Plano, Texas, and see Buck one last time, he was gone. I've had my say now, but before we invite attendees to come up one by one and say some words of remembrance on your own, I'd like to propose a toast to our dear friend. Well done, Buck. We'll do our best to keep telling the stories. Meanwhile, comma, peace. All right, please, anybody who feels the urge, come forward. Please do, please do.
John Needham.
All right, this is This is Toshio Aritake, who is quite the veteran.
Oh. I'm Toshio Aritake, on and off close friend of Mike Tharp while he was in Tokyo, as well as when I was visiting the United States when he was in Merced, south of San Francisco, and also where was it? Somewhere close to Long Beach. Anyway, we had a mutual friend by the name of John Needham, who used to be the one of the correspondents assigned to Tokyo by UPI, United Press International. And I asked him to chip in something to say about Mike. And this is what he wrote about him. Quote, Buck was one of the most courageous folks I've ever met. I never thought of him as foolhardy, though after getting everything taken from him in Mogadishu, I did wonder. Still, he kept on going. More important to me and so many others, though, was his friendship. He'd do things for you. He'd pick up stuff you needed. He'd make time for a meal. He'd listen to what you'd been doing or what kind of help you might need. Really listen. And that web of friendship extended across countries. You're off to Jerusalem. Look up Matthew Fisher there, a close buddy of Buck's and someone who then would introduce you to so many people you needed to meet in Jerusalem. Having trouble figuring out who to call in Merced or Fullerton or San Pedro, or that's San Pedro, California. That's where he had been living, and I visited him, by the way. To answer a question, Buck knew someone in those parts too, and was quick to offer up the name and the phone number. We lived not too far apart in San Pedro, technically a section of Los Angeles, but really its own little town in the 1990s and later, when he wasn't off traveling for some newspaper or magazine or another we got together periodically, usually for breakfast before we each started off on our own work days. Great conversations, fine stories, solid friendship through the decades. He was a good man. He was a friend. I find myself sometimes with a question I know he could answer and have to remind myself I cannot call him anymore. I miss him a lot. John Needham.
Just a brief comment. First, thanks to Brad for reminding us of some of the FCCJ greats, of which, of course, he is definitely one. And may he remain that way for another 50 years at least. Just a very brief story about Mike Tharp, because I've already told this story in the number one Shimban, but it's a reminder, I think, of the fact that Mike was not just a big man physically, he was a big man in spirit and character. I first met him in 1981, I think, or maybe in 1982. He'd just been appointed the bureau chief of the bureau here in Tokyo. And I was then the business editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review in Hong Kong. And we'd also dispatched to Tokyo a young Englishman called James Bartholomew. And the way it turned out was that Mike Tharp and James Bartholomew did not have a good relationship to start off with. So the editor, who was of the Far Eastern Economic Review, Derek Davis, a rather fiery Welshman, said to me, "Anthony, you're going to Tokyo next week, so I want you to get these two people working together. Read the Riot Act to them, knock their heads together, do whatever you have to do." So I strode into the office, which was then in Gaijin Ghetto, which was the 6th floor, I think, of the Nikkei building, determined to read the Riot Act to Mike Tharp and James Bartholomew. And I hadn't met Mike until that time. And as you know, he was a very strapping Texan. So, you know, I had to put on my most serious face and say, look, you know, this we're not too happy here in Hong Kong about your rather fractious relationship. So, and I read the Riot Act. And I finished, and there was a silence. And I thought Mike might say, look, God damn it, I'm the bureau chief here. What I say goes. And James Bartholomew might object to being told what to do by Mike Tharp. But instead, Mike stepped up to me, stuck out his hand and said, "Yes, boss, anything you say goes," with this big smile, this Tharp smile. And, you know, that was the way he dealt with situations, and I thought it was very good. It showed a certain amount of humility. He was a big man, but he was not afraid to say, okay. And from there on, the relationship went well. Not I think, due to my intervention, but because, as I say, Mike was the sort of guy who could take criticism and not be offended by it. And so, well, that's basically all I wanted to say, that he was a big man in many senses of the word. And I miss him, and we all miss him, I think. And may such people come again. Thank you.
Now, Tharp, why don't you stand up and tell us about your dad? Come on, put your food down. Tell us about your dad. Now, Tharp has done this beautiful visuals, and if you go to the microphone, they can ask you questions, or you can talk, or whatever you want to do. How's that? Now was born here in Tokyo, as you can imagine. Yeah, that's yours. It's all yours now. So these visuals are his.
Hi, I'm now Tharp. I am son of Mike Tharp. And I just want to thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart on behalf of my entire family for being here to celebrate the life of Mike Tharp. And it's just an overwhelming feeling, just this outpour of kind words and condolences, and just the presence of all of you in his life. It really, really affects me profoundly and made me realize how big he was. And yeah, it's a very weird feeling to be honest. Me and my dad didn't really live together as I grew up. I was born and raised in Tokyo, Japan. My mom raised me, and my first interaction with my father goes back to when I was third grade, 8 years old. I would hop on the airplane by myself, sent off by my mom. I didn't even realize that I was going by myself at the time. You know? I thought my mom was coming with me. And she was like, "Goodbye, see you in a month." And flew to Los Angeles, and my dad and Dylan, my sister, picked me up at the airport, and that was my highlight of the summer, essentially the highlight of my life even. We would spend entire months together. Dad would take time off from his work and dedicated the time with us. And this past summer, I got to do the same thing for my own kids, for our 10 years old Faith, my daughter, and Joshua, 6-year-old. It was part of his death wish that we take this road trip again to Oregon from California. We have a family member in Oregon, which was his closest members of the family, Uncle James, brother of his, who was the closest to him, who passed away in 1994, sadly, but we got to do this whole road trip again this summer, and it was like making one big circle, of tradition that my dad started for me and my sister Dylan. And in my family, I'm the one that had a fortune to raise my own family, so I got to do it all over again. And the occasion was kind of a sad thing. It was to basically scatter his ashes at the most memorable places in our lives, and we got to do it with my own kids. It was like very, very profound feeling, It's very moving moments. And actually, he requested us to take him to 3 different locations after his passing. One was in Kansas, where he was born and raised and went to college, and where his best friend, Greg Bean, my godfather, once lived, had a ranch there, and he visited his place several times, and he demanded that his ashes go there. So we went there right after this memorial gathering that took place in Plano, Texas, back in end of March, where Martin's son got to attend and gave extraordinary speech there as well. And that was the first location we got to spread his ash. And the second was Oregon, where I just spoke about, where I got to take my kids to. And thirdly, it was somewhere in the Pacific. He lived in San Pedro, southern part of Los Angeles, for about 12 years. About the same time he spent in Japan as well. So somewhere in the Pacific, he wanted to be there. And we haven't done the Pacific part of the scattering yet as a family, but I just thought it would be a great idea to just kind of bring him on today to be with you for the last time. So he's here with us today. So very thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for this. And I'm thinking about maybe a spoonful of him going to the Ohori right from here by the Kokyo, and some of them maybe in Mount Fuji where he climbed once, and some are in the ocean of Japan. So I'll probably be doing that in the rest of the trip here. But yeah, it's a very grateful feeling to be here today and learn about his life's achievement, which is the friendship. He had taught me many lessons, many life lessons, what to follow and what not to follow. He kind of led by the example in that, and one of them is how to make friends and keep friendship and maintain that throughout his life. And today, the turnout is literally the living proof of his legacy. So I'm really grateful for that, and I try to take that legacy with me along and try to reflect that on my own life and everybody that touches my life. So I'm so grateful for you all. Thank you so much. ありがとうございます。Thank you very much.
Tremendous to meet you.
Billy.
So my name is Billy Schwartz. I was at the Asian Wall Street Journal in 1979 and 1980. But I first met Mike because I had been an intern for the Wall Street Journal a few years before. And I wrote to him out of the blue. He didn't know me. He didn't know of me. But he wrote me back immediately to offer me to stay at his home, to have dinner with me, to provide any kind of help or advice that I might want to enter the world of journalism. And it was just an act of sort of selfless generosity that came to be my understanding of Mike. And we remained friends for, of course, decades after that. But I will never forget that he offered all this generosity to me without knowing anything about me, but it was just in his nature to be that kind of person. And now what has struck me since is how he maintained friendships like that with so many people, and managed to make each of us feel like we were, really important to him. That's a remarkable ability and a remarkable reflection of his character. So anyway, thank you.
Good work. Now, well said. And well produced. You've done very well. Goto-san.
I think he's gone. Can I make a very short comment, please?
Of course.
As a very short person. As I think many of you know, Mike was a very tall fellow and in many ways larger than life. I am not a very tall fellow, although I am larger than I once was. And in 1981, I was hoping against hope as a freelance journalist to be able to get into the Foreign Correspondents Club.
and Mike was the head of the membership committee at that point. And some of the other people had said, no, that he's working for a Japanese organization, he's a freelancer, blah, 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 blah. Mike came to talk to me, and he said, well, are you writing anything? And it just happened that, and I filed to Canadian Press at that point via the Reuters office in the Kyoto building, and I just had a whole massive line of teletype from a feature I'd sent. And I said, well, I've got this. And he went, that's tall, that's longer than me. I think you're in. And since 1971, sorry, 1980, yeah, 81, he's been a mentor, a friend, a Facebook jouster, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wanted to say, because of him, I'm still here. Thank you.
My name is Masayoshi Kanabayashi. I had worked with him for more than 4 years, and he gave me a chance to work with the Wall Street Journal. And I don't know the full sense of this English, kimosabe, but he was really my kimosabe. Thank you.